In the second lecture, I want to explore the roots and the foundations for textual criticism. And believe it or not, the origins of textual criticism had roots in missional or in evangelistic enterprises. Early on in the church, as evangelists and apologists went out and engaged the culture, and especially as Christians were discussing the Bible with Jewish persons to try to convert them to Christianity, there was a recognition that there were multiple texts of the same books floating around. And some of the early forerunners of this were Origen. As you can see, he was in the mid-2nd century, and he was an evangelist. And as he went out, and they used the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, and he lived in Alexandria, Egypt. As he was talking to Jewish persons and trying to show them messianic texts and such, he found that he would say, well, look, the Bible says, and the people that he were talking to would pull out their versions of the Bible and say, well, my Bible doesn't say that. And so Origen found out that some of the very texts that he needed to use in order to evangelize there were competing versions of them. And so what Origen's solution was, was to create the original, or maybe one of the first parallel Bibles. And listen to what he did. He made a 6-column, handwritten, annotated parallel Bible in which he actually included the original Hebrew text, at least the text that was around in Alexandria, Egypt. He had someone help him transliterate the Hebrew letters into Greek so he'd be able to pronounce them. And then he had 4 different Greek versions of the Old Testament. He had a translation by a Jewish scholar named Aquila, one by a man named Symmachus, one by a man named Theodotion, and then he had what he thought was the Septuagint. And so he had these 4 different Greek translations. And what Origen did is he coded this, and he marked all the places where the translations were different. So when he was talking and studying a passage, he would not have that problem of my Bible doesn't say this. So he went through and created this incredible scholarly apparatus. And for what reason? Think about this. So that he could be a better evangelist. This thing ends up being 7,000 pages long. Massive. Now, unfortunately, it was all lost because Origen got himself into trouble with the church, and so this thing was burned, but there have been a few pieces of it and that have been discovered. So incredible. One of the early foundations for textual criticism was a recognition that there were competing texts, and if one's going to study the Scriptures and help other people to study the Scriptures, we have to know what the original text would have been. Now, the second forerunner was a man named Jerome. Jerome he was a contemporary of St. Augustine, and so he lived around 400 AD. And Jerome was commissioned by the Pope to create a Latin version of the Bible, because there were multiple Latin translations available, and the Pope wanted Origen to create an official one. And the Pope's idea was he wanted Origen to take the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and create an official Latin translation. This would be for the Western or Latin-speaking part of the church. They wanted a scholarly translation. So Jerome starts his project, but he runs into some of the same problems that Origen did by finding that there wasn't clear always what the Septuagint was saying. And so Jerome decided it was what really needed to happen was not to try to make a Latin translation from the Greek translation, which amounts to a translation of a translation, but instead he wanted to get back to the original Hebrew. So Jerome learns Hebrew, and his translation of the Old Testament and also the New Testament is known as the Vulgate, and that ends up being the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church for over a millennium. Now, what's interesting about this is not everybody was happy with Jerome's translation, including Augustine, because, again, Jerome goes back to the original Hebrew. to make his translation. And what happened when he went back to the original Hebrew is there were differences between the Septuagint Greek translation and the original Hebrew. So some of, like, say, for example, St. Augustine's favorite passages that he used to preach from end up being changed. And so his sermons didn't work so well with the new translation, even though presumably Jerome's translation was more accurate. But what Jerome helped the church to see was the importance of going back behind the Greek translation to the original Hebrew text and to begin to value the Hebrew text as the focus of study for Christians.